Ephesus. But I guess since Paul spent 3 years there, that's okay for us to spend 3 weeks in Ephesus. But we're not through yet. We still have a lot left to go. And as we studied last week, sound like I'm going and coming again. But as we discussed last week, we talked about the miracles that Paul was working, how unusual and extraordinary they were, and about the sons of Sceva who attempted to exorcise an evil spirit, and that evil spirit leapt on them, and we would say in Alabama, it whooped them. And they left out of the room, out of that house, beaten and naked and bloodied up. So there's now a transition that Luke is going to give us here in verse 21. He said, when these things were accomplished, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. Now, when I read this, I realize that Luke is recording Paul's plans, and sometimes he gives us a very detailed explanation. Sometimes he just gives us a summary, and that's the way it is now. And what Luke is trying to tell us, after the event of these exorcists had passed, then Paul planned to leave. He had planned in the Spirit to leave, but it says he was going to go to Macedonia and Achaia. Now, one of the things that we do not read here is why Paul is going to go to Macedonia and Achaia. And so in order to appreciate that, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go with me to the book of Romans, and let's go to Romans 15, and we're going to begin with verse 22 and go through verse 33. And this would actually be real good for you to write this in the margin of your Bible, because it reflects to us much more detail of what Paul is going to do, why he's going to Macedonia and Achaia. If Paul's plan is to go to Jerusalem, why does he want to go west? In fact, let me just go ahead and show you the map. If Paul is here at Ephesus and his destination is Jerusalem, why is he going to go to Macedonia and then to Achaia before he goes? Well, let's pick up with Romans 15 and verse 22. For this reason, I also have been much hindered in coming to you. But now, no longer having a place in these parts and having a great desire to these many years to come to you, whenever I journey to Spain, I shall come to you, for I hope to see you on my journey and to be helped on my way there by you, if first I may enjoy your company for a while. Now, Paul is writing to the Romans. Now, if I go back here to look at what he said, I want us to go see Rome. Paul has it in his mind, and he even writes the Romans. He says, I want to come to you. But then he begins to explain. He said in verse 25, but now I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints. For it pleased those from, now listen carefully, Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem. It pleased them indeed, and they are their debtors, for if the Gentiles have been partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister to them in material things. Therefore, when I have performed this and have sealed to them this fruit, I shall go by way of you to Spain. But know that when I come to you, I shall come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ. Now I'm going to stop here at this point. Paul is saying writing to the Romans, and he says, I'm planning on coming to you, but I've got to go to Macedonia and Achaia first. Well, now I want you to turn over with me to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 16. You already know this very well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on discussing this, but let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and let's begin with verse 1. Now, concerning the collection for the saints As I have given order to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. Now, when Paul's writing the Corinthians, before getting there, saying, okay, I want you to have a collection on the first day of the week, what's that going to go to in this case specifically? Jerusalem, for those needy saints. Now, if you'll turn with me to 2 Corinthians for just a moment, and let's go to chapter 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Pick up with verse 1. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed upon the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, in the abundance of their joy, and their deep poverty abounded to the riches of their liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we should receive the gift and the fellowship of ministering to the saints. And when Paul is writing to the Corinthians, he said, let me tell you how generous the Macedonians were. They ask us with much urgency, Paul, accept what we're offering. But if you look at what he's saying here about them, he talks about their ability to give, and he says in verse 2 that the abundance of their joy and their financial condition is described as deep poverty. What does it mean to say that somebody lives in deep poverty? They didn't have much. But how are they giving? They're giving not only according to their ability, they're giving beyond their ability. Well, that's what it's going to do. It's going to say, let's go on over to chapter 9 for just a second. That's maybe a good point here. Chapter 9, let's look at verse 1 and 2. Now, concerning the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous for me to write to you, for I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. He talked about the brethren of Achaia from Corinth wanting to give over a year ago, and when they heard about the brethren at Achaia wanting to give, what did they say? Let us give too. And so Paul, as we go back here to Acts chapter 19, verse 21, when he says, when these things were accomplished, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem. Luke doesn't tell us why he's really going here, but Paul tells us in Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 16, and 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. So you understand Luke's description here, but he says, after that, I want to go to Rome. And actually, Rome wasn't his final planned destination. You know what was? Spain. And I want to go west. And of course, the reason why Paul wanted to go west, he wanted to go to where no one had ever been before, where the Lord's name had not been named. So, verse 21 tells us a lot about that. And then now, let's look at verse 22. So he sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for some time. Now, that's interesting. Why would he send Timothy and Erastus ahead? Okay. I don't think it's so much preparing a place to stay is, what was Paul concerned about, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2, when he would arrive there? And he'll illustrate that in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 as well. He didn't want to, when he arrived in Corinth, say, okay, y'all promised, let's just make it an even number. Let's say y'all promised $10,000 for the needy saints in Jerusalem. And if Paul arrives and they've got $5,000 raised, what are they going to have to do? There'll be some gatherings when he comes. And then he has to go to people and say, you said you would give so-and-so. Where is it? And if Paul's destination is Jerusalem and he's wanting to be there by the feast, why is it important to send somebody ahead? Have it prepared, have it ready so that when he arrives, and there's also going to be brethren who's going to travel with Paul with this money. And so evidently the church is going to need to decide who's going to travel with him. And so he sends Timothy and Erastus here. We know who Timothy is. Do you know who Erastus is? He's a treasurer of the city at Corinth. And that's Romans 16, verse 23. What I think is very interesting also as well is Erastus was the treasurer of the city of Corinth. Is he a man you can depend upon and trust with money? Absolutely. He's also himself a very wealthy man. When we go to the city of Corinth and we go over to the theater, there is a big marble piece that basically has Erastus' name that says for his aedileship, in other words, for his generosity, he paid for this street. So he's evidently a man of great means and a great ability. And so Paul has sent them ahead. And you can imagine, here's a man of considerable talent and ability. You got Timothy. It's a great combination of people here. Well, let's go to verse, there's a map showing how that Timothy and Erastus probably traveled. But let's begin with verse 23 because Paul's about ready to leave, but there's something going to take place. About that time, there arose a great commotion about the way. What do you mean, the way? Christian, okay. They use that as a descriptive term, and I wondered, if that's not what the Lord planted in their minds when he said in John chapter 14, you remember, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes unto the Father but by me. And so evidently the way is the terminology that Luke is going to use, and he says there's going to be a great commotion. What is a great commotion? Uproar. People are upset. And there's a reason why. So let's pick up with verse 24 and we'll start seeing what's going on. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. Now, I'm going to just sort of take these verse by verse here for a while. He's a silversmith. Now, we would tend to think if a person works with gold or silver today would be a person who would work with jewelry. But in biblical times, a silversmith's primary job would be to overlay a piece of wood or a piece of stone with silver or with gold. And in this case, it said he made silver shrines of Diana. What is a shrine? What are you talking about? I've got one. I didn't bring it in the auditorium this morning, but I'm going to show you a photo of it. I got a little one about this big. I bought when I'm in Ephesus. I didn't buy it for an idolatrous purpose. I bought it for an illustration purpose. Joe's glad I'm not an idolater now. But I wanted to show people what it looked like. But he would make these, and people would come and buy them, but not for souvenirs. They bought them for the purpose of thinking they're carrying a piece of their God home with them. That if they have it in their house, it's some kind of blessing. Was that Tom? Think it protects them or something? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But in their minds, though, they believe they carried a little bit of Diana with them. And that was a part of their religion. Now, here's a photo. Both of these are of different ones in the Ephesian Museum. And it was a statue. One of them has a hat like on, and the other, but both of them have these various like fruits hanging from the chest. And but this is the statue of Diana, or more accurately, Artemis is the statue. Now, the temple that was there at Ephesus looks like your Roman, Greco-Roman building. Looks a lot like the Parthenon. But you'll see in the middle there was where the statue of Diana was. But this doesn't really give you a good perspective. I want you to look at this. This is the size of a football field. That is the size of the temple of Artemis, or the temple of Diana. And it was roughly, the columns were 60 feet high. The floor to ceiling here is 23 feet. Just imagine 3 times the height. That's the height of the columns. In fact, it was the largest building in all of Greece, Rome, and Asia. And you can just imagine the huge building that it was. In fact, it was 4 times the size of the Parthenon. Have any of y'all been to the Parthenon in Nashville? Well, this one is 4 times the size of the Parthenon. So it's really an amazing thing. Well, let's see what takes place here in verse 25. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, "Men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade." Now, notice he says men and workers of similar occupation. When workers who work in a particular field get together, what do you call that? Well, we're going to call it a trade guild. Because a union usually are actually collective bargaining. These are not so much collective bargaining as they are a part of people who work together, maybe would also trade, techniques, their apprentices. And so for that reason, they are called together. And he says, "Men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade." What do you know about these guys? Are they focused on the worship of Diana? You're messing with their money now. And, what's concerning them is this Paul that's coming through here, he's hurting our business. And if Paul's hurting our business, what's that going to do to us as a people if this starts hurting our business this badly? And so for that reason, I'd like for you to just imagine, what if all the people who are brewing the brewer's arts in Lynchburg, and somebody comes through and starts saying, "You know what, the Bible teaches we ought not get drunk." And preacher starts having a lot of effect in Lynchburg, Tennessee about not getting drunk. What do you think would happen to the people at Jack Daniels? They wouldn't be very happy about it. And they would begin to start saying, "Okay, we got to hush this guy up here." And so what we're going to do, let's notice verse 26. "Moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods made with hands." Now that explains to you a little bit more about their trade here. Paul is preaching not only at Ephesus, but this whole area, and he's saying to these people is, they're not gods made with hands. What they are doing here in all of this is preaching that, well, you've got in your hands a piece of stone, a piece of wood, a piece of metal, and it's not a god at all. And the power of those idols that they were selling was that people believed they actually had a part of God with them. And Paul had taught that not only here, but he taught it in Lystra and Derbe, Acts 14, verse 15. in this passage, Acts chapter 17, verse 29 at Athens. And so here Paul is preaching again that they're not idols made with, they're not gods made with hands. Well, let's look at verse 27. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised, and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. Now, he's saying our trade is something we're worried about, but he says it's even bigger than that. He said the temple of the great goddess Diana. I just showed you an artist's drawing of what it might have looked like, how large it was. It may be despised and her magnificence destroyed. Ephesus was, as we'll see later, considered to be the temple guardians of the worship of Diana. And if you destroy the worship of Diana, let me compare this to, how do you think people would react in Mecca if everybody were to say, well, that thing they march around has no religion, it's not even a real religion. And it's not, but how do you think people would react if you were in Saudi Arabia and told them that? I don't even doubt they would. There would be a mob that would come about and you wouldn't survive it. Well, Paul is in the city where Diana is worshipped, and they're saying all Asia and the world worship Diana, Artemis, and if that's the case, we're in danger of this becoming a disrepute. Oh, yes. But in the Greco-Roman world where they lived, that was, when we go to Sardis, there's a huge, I showed you, in fact, when I preached on Sardis a few weeks ago, I showed you some of the columns that were sized there. The base of a column, I couldn't reach around a third of it with arms outstretched. They're huge. And that was the temple of Artemis there at Sardis. It was a very prominent religion. Yeah. That was their. Well, there was at Ephesus. There were other gods, but Diana was the dominant one. That's the one. That was their bread and butter as far as their trade was concerned. Demetrius was a very common name, and I would doubt to think so, but. We'll talk about Alexander here in just a few moments, though. But I would doubt that's the same Demetrius. Okay, let's look at verse 28. Now, when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Now, who are they here and here? Those silversmiths, those who are of the same trade. What do you have to do if you want to create a riot? You have to get a small group of people stirred up, and when you get them stirred up, what do? Get everybody else upset. That doesn't mean everybody else knows what's going on, but these guys do, and they know what they're trying to accomplish. They're trying to confront, if you will, what Paul has been teaching, and so they cry out, saying, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And if you'll permit me just to use a little sports humor, if you see somebody in Alabama and they're wearing an A and it said, you say them, you know what they say to one another? Roll Tide. If you say, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," what does that do to people in Ephesus? He says, "Go Vols." What it does, it says that this is who we are for. This is our God. Well, let's go to verse 29. So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. Now notice you started out with a they in verse 28, which was these artisans, the silversmiths. They got the whole city filled with confusion. You know, next thing you know, you got 20 people screaming out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And then a little while later, you got more people screaming out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And you start hearing that. And so everybody's just going to start going to the theater. Why do you go to the theater? That's the place of public gathering. Where do you suppose everybody would gather today if you had to have a gathering in McMinnville and everybody got all stirred up about something? Courthouse Square is probably where everybody would go. Now, is there anything special about that? It's a place where people, it's downtown. That's especially the old folks. That's where you grew up. That's where you went to town. You always go to the Courthouse Square. Well, they are doing that, but they've seized two people now, Gaius and Aristarchus. And notice they are Macedonians, and they are Paul's travel companions. If you can't find Paul, who are you after? Anybody close to him. And so they're people who are not from Ephesus. There's a distinction there between them. And so it says they seized them and then they went into the theater. Now, we'll tell you about Gaius and Aristarchus. Luke's going to refer to them in Acts 20 and verse 4. And he's going to say there, Aristarchus and Secundus of Thessalonica, and then Gaius is of Derbe. So they know that they're not local people there. And he'll refer to them also in chapter 27, verse 2, and Colossians 4, verse 10, and Philemon 1 and verse 24. Okay, verse 30 now. Let me go, first of all, here's a picture. And by the way, that's Alan in the middle of the picture down there with a white shirt on. The picture of the theater there in Ephesus. It's huge. Seat at least 25,000 people. That's, gives you some kind of idea of the size of it. And here's a drawing of what it would have looked like. But everybody would have run to there. And you can imagine the sound that would have been taking place as everybody's screaming out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." It's like, the sound at a football game where you've got all these people standing around and they're screaming and they're hollering. Well, verse 30 says, and when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. Is Paul afraid? Not at all. But it says the disciples would not allow him. Why won't they allow him? Yeah, they know if he goes in there, they're going to, mob will attack him. Paul's not afraid, but they know that Paul's too valuable to allow him to be killed in front of this mob. It would have hurt the church as well. So they do not allow him to go in. Now, let's look at verse 31. Then some of the officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent to him, pleading him that he would not venture into the theater. The word for officials of Asia is Asiarchs. And these are people that Rome placed in various cities to make sure that things were kept calm. In other words, they are workers from Rome, but they're called Paul's friends. Now, what does that tell you? He had friends in Rome, but he has friends in high places. His work there at Ephesus has been extremely successful, that he has been able to have others, and they're pleading with him that he would not venture into the theater. Paul, you don't need to go there. The disciples are telling him not to go. The Asiarchs are telling him don't go. Well, verse 32, some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Now, what does that tell you? Mob mentality. You can often see people who will get upset over something that they don't even have an idea what it's all about. They're just upset. I think it's almost funny, like church problems. Somebody says, well, everybody's upset. Well, what are they upset about? I don't know. You have to go ask them. Well, then why are you telling me? Why are you upset? I don't know. I'm just, well, you've got everybody here, and all they know is they're screaming out, great is Diana of the Ephesians. And it says, for the assembly was confused. They didn't know why they'd come together. Well, verse 33. They drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hand and wanted to make his defense to the people. Now notice you have Alexander, and the Jews are putting him forward. What kind of man do you think Alexander would have been if the Jews are putting him forward? Do you think he would have been a Jew or a Gentile? He'd have been a Jew. And it says that they put him forward, and he motioned with his hands and wanted to make his defense to the people. Let me tell you what I think Alexander's doing. He's going to say, Paul's a Jew, but he's not with us. Paul's a Jew, but we don't believe like Jews do. We don't believe like Paul does. You say, well, why would they be doing that? Well, I want you to turn with me to 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20. And then we'll go to 2 Timothy as well. 1 Timothy 1 and verse 20. I guess looking up the clock, I probably just ought to read this. I'll just put the scriptures down and you can look them up. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20. And then 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 14. He said, of whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I delivered to Satan, that they might learn not to blaspheme. Now 2 Timothy 4, verse 14. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. What kind of occupation does Alexander have? He's a coppersmith. Guess what he makes? He's probably either doing it, making the idols himself, or he is a part of the same trade guild as the rest of these guys. And Paul says he's blaspheming. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 20. He said he did me much harm. 2 Timothy 1 and 4 verse 14. What that tells me is that Alexander is a man saying, hold on guys. The Jews have put him forward and say, hey, we got to distance ourselves, but it's going to hurt us. So they put him forward, and he wanted to make his defense. Verse 34, but when they found out he was a Jew, with one voice they cried out for about 2 hours, great is Diana of the Ephesians. Why did they reject listening to Alexander? Okay. What are Jews known for about their religion? One God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. You remember what the first commandment is? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And they know that the Jewish teaching is monotheism, one God, the true God of heaven. And so when you're going to put a Jew up in front of the crowd about Diana, they're like, no, we're not going to listen to this guy. So it says for about 2 hours, they cried, great is Diana of the Ephesians. I tell you what, there's a lot of things I'm willing to do, but I don't know if I want to scream out for 2 hours, great is Diana of the Ephesians. That's just, but it's a mob mentality. And when mob mentalities take place, it's surprising what kind of things people will do. Now, what's going to result from this in verse 35, and when the city clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple guardian of the great goddess Diana and the image which fell down from Zeus?" Now, the city clerk here is the person who was an administrative official whose job it was to call and dismiss public meetings. That's why he's there. Now, he was there to calm things down and to dismiss the meeting. You know, one of the things that Rome just could not stand? Disturbance. Riots were put down harshly. And he knows that what's going to take place is if they don't do something, there's going to be have to be held in account, and he himself is going to be held accountable for this. So he says, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple guardian of the great goddess Diana? Now notice this very carefully. And the image which fell down from Zeus. Likely a meteorite fell somewhere in that area. That's what we're assuming. And from that, they developed an idol of Diana or Artemis. And I never watched the movie. I did see an advertisement for it in the 1980s. I don't know how many of you saw it. The Gods Must Be Crazy. Do you know what it is? A guy throws a Coke bottle out of an airplane, and it lands in this tribe in Africa. And they all see this Coke bottle. Oh, we got to worship this Coke bottle. And, they, like I said, I didn't see all the movie. I looked it up. But this South African tribe thought that this was a gift from the gods, this Coke bottle. And, well, I'm sure that's what they probably funded the movie as far as that. But their idea is that whatever it was, that's what made them the guardians of this great image which fell down from Zeus, which talks about another one of their gods there. So this temple of Artemis here was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Very important. Well, verse 36, therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. He's trying to say there's nothing that you can do that'll change anything. His belief was Diana is, who she is. We know who we are. You ought to just be quiet about this and do nothing rashly. And then verse 37, for you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess. Now, first of all, they're not robbers of temples. What is a temple robber? One who takes the sacrifices that were meant for that goddess. Paul didn't do that. The others didn't do that. When he says they're blasphemers of your goddess, would you say Paul was, in a sense, a blasphemer of Artemis or Diana? Yeah. Because he was saying they're not real gods at all here. And so, verse 38. Yeah. Yeah. He's not stopping them and not robbing their temples. But then he says, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. Here he's saying that there is an opportunity for them to bring them before the Jewish or the Roman officials. If you go to Acts 18, you remember Gallio in Corinth, how Paul was brought there before him, and they ended up beating the people who brought them. And so he says, if they want to, if feel like they've got a legitimate complaint, carry them to court. But don't do what you're doing here. This is vigilante justice. And he's saying that's not what we need to be doing. He said, let them bring them to the courts. Verse 39, but if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in the lawful assembly. What is he telling them about this assembly they're in right now? It's not lawful. What we're doing now is not acceptable. And we're dismissing this assembly. You want to go to court, but we're not going to do what we're doing here now. In verse 40, for we are in danger of being called into question for today's uproar. There is no reason which we may give to an account for this disorderly gathering. What is this town clerk trying to do? He's trying to keep the Romans away. They want to remain a free city. They want to remain to do what they're doing. And he says, we're going to be called into question for what's going on today. People are going, the Roman officials are going to say, you had a gathering of a riot for 2 hours, and you're going to have to answer for that. And he says, we don't have any reason to give. What would he say to the Roman officials? Not much he could say. And if he said, well, the people did it themselves, that means you didn't do your job keeping control of the city. And so he's ready to get them all and gone. What that does, verse 41, and when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly, which leads us perfectly ready for Acts chapter 20, verse 1. Thank you very much.